Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Hello again, I'm your host, Paul Barter, and this episode is entitled A Spoonful of Sugar, Making Parking Fees Palatable. Before I start, don't forget you can find out a lot more about Reinventing Parking at the website, reinventingparking.org. Paying for on-street parking is no fun, but paid parking is also the most useful tool in parking management. So this episode is about lots of promising suggestions for making parking fees popular. Wait, did I say popular? No. Silly me. You can't make parking fees popular, of course not. Let me try that again. So this episode is about lots of promising suggestions for making parking fees less unpopular, so that more places that really do need parking fees can get them and get their benefits. Well-designed paid parking is often exactly what streets need to overcome parking chaos, nuisance and conflict, and to help cities wean themselves away from minimum parking requirements. Unfortunately, the unpopularity of parking fees is no joke. Here's a quote. In Melbourne, 96% of parking is free to the user, and threats to the protected status of free parking can evoke anger and sometimes overt violence. The Arab Spring, so-called, in the suburb of Yarraville is an example. The installation of parking meters at $1.50 an hour on a shopping strip led to street protests, banners and vandalism and other political action. When this failed, councillors were physically attacked at a council meeting. Local traders compared the incident to the Arab Spring, in that, other channels being exhausted, violence was the only option remaining for standing up and saying this isn't right. The parking meters were switched off. That was urban planning academic Elizabeth Taylor in her article, Journey into the Immense Heart of Car Parking. It's a good read, and I'll put a link in the show notes post on the Reinventing Parking website. Now, that was an extreme case, but there are places like Yarraville all over the world that need well-designed parking fees but are prevented by the political difficulties. Let's move on to the actual suggestions. Some of this is my thinking, but I'm also drawing on lots of other people's suggestions too. So here is number one, which is a little bit meta, as they say, but don't worry, we'll get to down-to-earth practical suggestions in a minute. Number one, think differently and talk differently about on-street parking. It's a really bad idea to portray free-of-charge parking as somehow the natural state of things. It is natural to need to manage an overburdened resource like curbsides in busy areas. Free parking is natural only in places where there is hardly any parking demand. People who say free parking is natural also often say it's a public good. Now, assuming they mean that in its proper sense, claiming parking is a public good means 1. My parking doesn't impact on your parking, and 2. that charging a fee to ration it would be way more trouble than it's worth. Now, those two claims are sometimes true, but only in places and at times with plenty of empty parking spaces. Otherwise, my parking does impact on yours, and charging fees is worthwhile. Most urban parking is not a public good, and keeping it free of charge is not natural. It's an overused common property resource, like overburdened village grazing land. It's under pressure and it needs management. So please push back when anyone claims it's natural to keep on-street parking free of charge. Here's another claim to push back on. Number 2. Have a good answer to the claim that this is an outrageous entry fee to a place that should be free for everyone. When on-street parking fees are proposed near a popular beach or public park, someone will inevitably object by saying that the parking fees, are effectively an entry fee for the beach or for the park, which must be kept free of charge for all. Now, hidden in this objection is the car-dependent assumption that going somewhere and driving there are the exact same thing. People who go almost everywhere by car start to think that way, of course. They don't say that a bus fare to the beach is an outrageous entry fee, and the inconsistency doesn't seem to occur to them. I think they must be assuming that free on-street parking is the natural thing, as we talked about just now. So they think of a parking fee as an extra imposition somehow and not part of the cost of their trip, like a bus fare or the petrol that they might have paid for. But we need to defend such parking fees and push back against the entry fee objection. It's a good start to point out that bus or taxi fares to the beach or park are not free. But we also need to counter the free parking is natural idea here too, again. Now, if you think that might not be very persuasive to the kind of person who says parking fees are outrageous entry fees, well, you're probably right. In most of my suggestions today, you probably won't persuade the angry ones. But don't forget all the people out there who are not angry and are still open to persuasion. And I'm just getting started. None of the suggestions today are killers on their own. But put them all together, and I hope they should make parking fees easier to get done. Suggestion number 3. Proceed one area at a time with local demonstrations. One of the beauties of parking management, including parking fees, is that it's local. This means we can proceed incrementally, area by area. You don't need to cover the whole city at once. In fact, please don't do that. As an example, in January's Reinventing Parking, we heard about Auckland in New Zealand and how it's using this strategy for its ongoing rollout of parking fees in its streets. Each successful localized implementation eases the fears and helps counter the objections of each subsequent expansion. Suggestion 4 is related. Use trials. This one is inspired by tactical urbanism. The idea is to use temporary trial changes to demonstrate the benefits without the need for a final decision, at least initially. This approach is famously often used in street design changes, which almost always actually include changes to parking. But a trial-based approach could also be useful for pricing proposals as well. Of course, actually installing parking meters would make for an expensive trial, and it would provoke suspicion that the decision was already made, a foregone conclusion. So why not try out parking fees with lower capital cost payment options, such as phone-based payments along with human parking attendants, at least temporarily? Of course, the institutional work to enable a pricing trial would be a bit more complicated than for a street design. But still, I think it's worth considering for cities who are struggling to get started on parking fees. Now let's talk about the goals of on-street parking fees. So suggestion number 5 is, please don't make revenue the goal. It's political poison to focus on general revenue. Of course, it is understandable for governments to be interested in revenue. Cities need funds to do important things. But revenue should be seen as a happy side effect of good parking management, not its purpose, or at least not its primary purpose. No matter what you do, someone will claim that the parking fees are just a cash grab. Don't make it easier for them. This suggestion also means not letting revenue considerations influence the specific price setting and system planning decisions either. Such decisions should be based on parking management goals, not revenue ones. I'll return to the question of goals a little later, but the bottom line is make parking management the purpose, not revenue. But for now, I need to talk some more about the revenue from parking fees. So suggestion number 6, consider radical generosity on parking revenue. This is especially relevant if you're trying to introduce parking fees to new areas, which is the difficult thing. So here's a bold claim. Getting better parking management is more important than getting new revenue from the parking management. The wider social costs of rotten parking management and its side effects are huge. In any case, the city won't get any revenue if the parking management can't make it through the political process. So why not make a really strenuous effort to prove that parking revenue is not the goal? The next few suggestions are relevant to that idea of making a strenuous effort, of radical generosity. Suggestion 7. Earmark parking revenue to improve public acceptance. I should note that earmarking revenue and tying the city's hands on that revenue is not ideal. General revenue is more efficient, and it's often more of a pro-poor use of the revenue. But, as I said before, unfortunately, it's usually politically poisonous. So parking is one case where earmarking is usually needed to sweeten the deal. But what should any parking revenue surplus be earmarked for? Here are some earmarking issues to keep in mind. The benefits need to be salient. In other words, they need to be noticeable and relevant. Using the funds for something relevant to mobility is one way to be salient. And you need to please the right groups of people, such as groups who may otherwise veto the fees. Local residents and local businesses are usually examples. But of course, this also causes dilemmas. Targeting benefits to certain influential groups who may not necessarily be needy groups also has risks. It might alienate others. For example, one of Donald Shoup's suggestions here is to give local residents special discounts on parking fees. This is actually possible now with most of the modern digital payment options that capture license plates. It would be popular with the locals, of course, but might be resented by others. Here are some other possible recipients of earmarked parking revenue. Local enhancements, especially the local enhancements that are valued by local residents and businesses. Or local enhancements, but focused mostly on local accessibility and mobility enhancements. For example, in the March edition of Reinventing Parking, Tony Jordan explained how parts of Portland, Oregon, are using parking revenue on a program for locals called the Transportation Wallet, which is a package of bus credit, streetcar credit, bike share membership, and car share memberships. Or donate the revenue surplus to local charities. Or give ratepayers a rebate on local taxes. Or simply give a share of the money to every household and business in the area. Or maybe even give the whole population tradable parking credits, which can be used to pay for parking in the municipality. You'll need a local process to find out what's best for your city. I never said this was easy, did I? Suggestion 8. Set up a trusted institution to oversee the earmarked parking revenue and how it's spent. Donald Shoup's main proposal on this is to set up an institution called a Parking Benefit District. So a PBD has the responsibility for deciding on how to use the revenue locally. So this appeals to local residents and local businesses by increasing their democratic input on the use of the funds. Parking benefit districts also aim to increase trust in the financial oversight of the revenue. But as always, they need checks and balances to make sure they actually live up to that trust. The idea is slowly spreading, and Donald Shoup's website has some excellent examples of real PBDs in action. Suggestion 9. Target the benefits both locally and citywide. There's a dilemma here, and I noticed that Donald Shoup himself has been wrestling with it over the years. Some cities earmark parking revenue for something like public transport, which is a citywide thing. San Francisco, for example, does that. But spending on citywide systems may not be enough to please those local stakeholders and ease the local resistance. Indeed, San Francisco still does have a lot of trouble extending parking fees to new areas, to new streets. So Shoup has often argued that spending parking revenue locally was best to make sure the benefits are tangible enough for those key local stakeholders. But in recent years, I noticed that Prof. Shoup has written about potential equity problems with this. If mainly wealthy areas are the ones with the most in-demand on-street parking, then keeping earmarked parking revenue very local could worsen geographical disparities in many cities. So, for example, in a June 2018 opinion piece for the New York Times entitled "A Fix for New York's Parking Problems," Shoup offered this suggestion. To avoid unequal public spending among the parking benefit districts, New York can use what in public finance is called power equalization. Regardless of the revenue each district earns, the city can give every district equal revenue per curb space to pay for added public services. So I'm keen to know more about that suggestion and how that might go down politically and how it might work. Now, let's get back to that earlier issue of the goals of parking fees. So suggestion 10. The goal should be parking management, in particular vacancies. It harms support for on-street parking fees if the city can't explain their purpose persuasively. And if the city itself is not clear about this, the fees are unlikely to get updated wisely. It's politically difficult to update them if the city can't point to an easy-to-explain reason to adjust them. So eventually the city ends up with parking fees that make no positive difference. People then ask, what is the point? They start to assume the purpose is revenue. And they might be right. So be clear and choose the goal wisely. The purpose of on-street parking fees needs to be parking management, which means better conditions in the streets. And the best specific parking management goal to focus on is vacancies. This means aiming to keep a few parking spaces vacant on each section of street. This goal is based on evidence. We get 0 parking search time for on-street parking if the vacancy rate is about 15% or better. But if on-street parking is any more full than that, we start to get negative side effects like double parking, illegal parking, excessive searching and cruising for parking. So we want parking fees to create vacancies. To do that, we need to set the fees with that goal in mind. And this is the demand-based approach to setting the parking fees. It's probably familiar to you if you have been a regular listener or reader of Reinventing Parking. It'll be familiar to you if you've read the work of Professor Donald Shoup. And more cities have started to use this approach. I listed them in my June 18 article on Reinventing Parking. Every city with Goldilocks parking fees. Examples include Calgary and Vancouver in Canada, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Baltimore and quite a few others in the USA. Demand-based parking pricing has various advantages, but today's focus is on how it eases the unpopularity of parking fees. So the next few suggestions are related to that. Suggestion 11. Demand-based pricing avoids making elected officials vote on routine price adjustments. Having city councillors vote whenever parking prices need adjusting is asking for trouble. It puts them in a difficult position. It casts them as the price-increasing villains. So avoiding those fights is a big advantage of demand-based fees. And don't consult the community on routine price changes either. That is predictably unhelpful. Now, I'm not suggesting being undemocratic here. Advocates of demand-based price setting, like me, say, yes, let's debate the price-setting approach and maybe repeat that exercise once a decade or so. So be democratic, but debate the right thing. Specific price adjustments should be frequent, routine, and data-driven, not a matter of debate and with no need for any votes by politicians. So, for example, the City of Seattle publishes a yearly report about the on-street paid parking occupancy situation and explains the various parking fee adjustments and how they are justified by the data in order to hit the target of enough vacancies. Seattle also relies on the same data to modify pricing zones, change the priced times, and even extend pricing to new locations. In some places, they have introduced time-of-day price variations as well. Suggestion 12 also relates to demand-based pricing. Have cheaper parking nearby. Walk a block, save a buck is the slogan used by Baltimore's parking authority for its demand-based parking price setting. Resentment of fees is lessened when people see that they can do something to reduce their costs. So the ability to save money by walking a little is a selling point of this approach to setting parking fees. Take full advantage. Shout about it like Baltimore. In fact, this is actually part of how parking fees work to improve the situation. On-street parking fees improve a street by nudging some motorists to park off-street or on streets where the parking pressure is lighter. And this is the crux of an answer to a common objection, which says, parking fees won't work here because we have such rotten public transport. Improving mobility options is one of the suggestions later. But in fact, most of the ability of on-street parking fees to ease the parking chaos comes from nudging motorists to change where they park, not how they travel. So in most cases, public transport is not necessary in order to see at least some improvement as a result of parking fees. There's a June 2017 post about this on Reinventing Parking. By the way, pricing zones need to be made quite small if we want people who are heading to a street with overburdened high-priced parking to have the option of cheaper parking nearby, which is what this suggestion 12 was all about. Suggestion 13 is similar. Have cheaper times to park too. Giving people options to save money can also mean making parking cheaper at quiet times. So time of day price variations, like I mentioned for Seattle, are used by many cities that have demand-based parking fees. They send the message that you have one more way to pay less. Visit off-peak if you can. Suggestion 14. Talk about charging the lowest prices that achieve the goal. Aiming for a low price sounds good, right? No one wants to pay more than necessary. But we also want effective parking management that actually solves parking problems. Demand-based setting of parking fees does both. It aims for the lowest price that hits the vacancies target, which is our evidence-based parking management goal. This might sound too good to be true, but it's not. It's inherent in this approach to setting the prices. Furthermore, demand-based pricing is not the revenue maximising strategy. Revenue would be maximised with a much higher vacancy target than is used in the typical demand-based parking fees system. This was explained by Donald Shoup in the High Cost of Free Parking book. It's really important to get this message across to retailers. The message about aiming for the lowest possible price to achieve the vacancies goal. Understandably, retailers are usually nervous that parking fees will deter customers. They need to understand that demand-based price setting strives not to do that. By the way, this is another reason to have small price zones, since it reduces the chance that a price that is right on average for a whole zone might inadvertently be too high and overdo it on some particular street. So Seattle again, for example, had to split its International District Chinatown zone for this exact reason. I explained about that in an August 2014 post on the Reinventing Parking website. Aiming for the very lowest price that achieves the vacancy goal is reassurance that the city will try hard not to overdo the fees. Donald Shoup has emphasised this point many times over the years. Suggestion number 15 sends a similar message. 15. Price the parking only where and when it is necessary. When the city is clear about the goal of its on-street parking fees, it becomes much clearer where and when fees are needed. They are only needed at places and times that regularly have full parking for an extended period. Everywhere else, parking can be free of charge on street. Suggestion 16. Make sure new fees result in visible, tangible improvements. When you're starting a new parking fee in a new place, it's very tempting to keep the price low to try to reduce the backlash. But pricing will be seen as a failure if timid pricing means that the parking remains saturated and chaotic. Remember, I said to emphasize parking management goals. This is most credible if people then see obvious results in the streets. This may also require some complementary efforts on parking enforcement, of course, and parking design, which is part of street design. Fortunately, many parking management improvements start with such an awful situation that the benefits are indeed highly tangible. But here's suggestion 17. If the benefits are disappointing, be ready to make adjustments. Maybe the prices are too low initially to generate enough vacancies. Maybe it was timidity, or maybe the initial estimate of the right prices was too low. Fixing this will be easier if you've been saying all along that you're using demand-based pricing and that you will adjust as necessary. Part of the plan was to have price reviews where you'll keep adjusting until the price is about right to get the results that you want. Even if you don't have a formal demand-based price setting system in place, you can still try to explain that the price needs to be raised again to make enough difference. But that's going to be difficult. Better to have demand-based pricing. Also, be ready to adjust the priced times or the boundaries. You may need to expand or shrink priced areas or adjust price zones, like Seattle did. Now, suggestions 18 and 19 are two short ones that are maybe a little obvious, but I'll say them anyway. Suggestion 18. Point to relatable examples. If you are extending parking fees to new places, it's great to be able to point to paid parking successes in a municipality nearby or within your own state or province or country. It's less common, but sometimes you can even point to past successes with paid parking in your own city. Johannesburg is fortunate that a few years ago it had a fairly successful experience with paid on-street parking. That system ended for reasons that had nothing to do with parking management. But that experience means that it should be politically easier for Johannesburg to reintroduce on-street parking fees in the future. Suggestion 19. Learn lessons from relevant paid parking failures too. If there has been a high-profile failure or a high-profile rejection of on-street parking fees in your city or nearby, you probably need to investigate what went wrong and try to avoid the same mistakes. So, for example, any municipality in Melbourne that tries to implement new on-street parking fees now needs to know how to avoid repeating Yarraville's parking experience that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Let's turn to equity issues now. Equity or fairness will always be a key line of attack on any pricing proposal. It's understandable, and it deserves to be taken seriously. So suggestion 20 is, point out that badly managed parking is not fair or equitable. If on-street parking in busy areas is not well managed, who gets the most convenient parking? Usually it's people who arrive early and park all day. How is that fair? We also know that weak parking management with no parking fees can lead to on-street chaos, road danger and congestion. For various reasons, those impacts tend to fall heavily on disadvantaged groups. But there's more. Parking chaos and congestion caused by parking mismanagement prompts cities and other governments to devote huge chunks of taxpayer money to easing those problems with supplies such as subsidised parking supply, road expansions and so on. That kind of investment benefits high-income motorists much more than low-income people with lower rates of car ownership. It prompts high parking minimums too, which harm housing affordability, and promotes sprawl, which hurts the poor too. So it's an equity strength that parking pricing can help prevent these outcomes. A blanket statement saying parking pricing is inequitable is inaccurate. Introducing parking fees can often be fairer than the status quo, if you think about it a little. Suggestion 21. If anyone says free parking is to help the poor, explain that free parking is a terrible way to help the poor. In many cities, cars are owned mainly by households with above average incomes. That's certainly the case in most cities in low-income and middle-income countries, and even in some districts within high-income cities too. So on average, parking fees imposed on car users are actually fairer than the prices of food or clothing prices. Here's Michael Manville in a recent Transfers magazine article talking about congestion pricing, but the point applies to parking fees too. Do free roads help the poor? Poor people have little money, so holding down prices can help them. But poverty is fundamentally a problem of low incomes, not high prices. The ideal anti-poverty program would therefore transfer money to low-income people and let them spend it as they see fit, not selectively lower the price of some goods and hope that poor people want them. Ideal programs aren't always feasible, of course, and efforts to give poor people money often encounter political resistance. Sometimes keeping prices low is the best we can do. But if lowering prices is the path we take, we should either lower prices only for the poor, or, if we lower them for everyone, do so only for goods the poor use disproportionately, as we do with transit fares. Free roads, especially at peak hours, satisfy neither of these criteria." End quote. And we can add, neither does free parking satisfy those two criteria. Suggestion 22. Beware of concern trolling. Many complaints about the unfairness of parking fees seem to be cover for opposition that is actually based on other grounds. It's concern trolling. Just be aware of that. But of course, be careful if you're going to accuse anyone of concern trolling. Suggestion 23. Do address real equity concerns. Affordable access is a strong reason to take action to help poor people reach the things they need. It's just that it's a weak argument for keeping parking free or cheap for everyone. Doing that can cause huge harm. Nevertheless, there may often be a case for special measures to help poor people, even poor motorists, when starting parking fees in a new area. One way might be to offer a certain number of parking credits to eligible low-income motorists, for example. Using part of the parking revenue to help the poor directly is also an option. And, of course, using some of the revenue to improve the modes of transport that are more used by poor people is also helpful. Here is one more point, specifically about equity issues. It's suggestion 24. Note that time limits are not especially fair either. Sometimes opponents of parking fees will claim that time limits are the fairer way to do the same thing. Now, time limits are okay in some circumstances, but as parking pressure rises, there's a limit to how short you can make the time limits. How is a 30-minute or a 1-hour time limit fair to people who need to stay a little longer than that? And compliance with time limits is always low, unless enforcement is fierce. But that enforcement is costly. It may come out of general revenue and deplete the funds that could be used for other things, including pro-poor spending. And that enforcement, that fierce enforcement, doesn't seem very fair to people who get a ticket for being a few minutes late back to their vehicle. So abolishing time limits can actually be popular. This brings me to suggestion 25. Do abolish time limits when you introduce parking fees. Some parking experts swear by having both time limits and fees. The idea is to get turnover, and perhaps the idea is to have a fail-safe in case the fees don't necessarily get updated often enough. But if the previous time limits were restrictive and enforcement of them was seen as overzealous, abolishing the time limits can be a really popular selling point for your new parking fees. People often really value having the new option of lingering over lunch or seeing a film, or the possibility of being delayed during an appointment that takes longer than expected. So it would be a shame to miss out on this boost to the popularity of parking fees by keeping the time limits. So remember, we're talking about how to make on-street parking fees less unpopular. And suggestion 26 is choose the payment mechanisms with care. I won't go into details on this, but the payment methods for any new parking fees need to strive not to irritate anyone, or at least try hard not to needlessly add to the inherent irritation of paying for parking. Suggestion 27. Point to mobility options and how they are being improved. I mentioned the options of parking at some distance and walking, and of parking at off-peak times earlier. But improving other mobility options also helps. Even though I mentioned that good public transport is not a necessity for implementing parking fees, it certainly will help the popularity, or at least reduce the unpopularity of parking fees, if you can point to alternatives. Some objectors will still complain about parking fees no matter how good the options become. But tangible improvements to public transport, bicycle facilities, to walkability, or to any of the various other mobility services can certainly ease the negativity about parking fees a little bit. It's especially helpful if you time the introduction of pricing to coincide with some significant improvement to one or another of the alternatives to driving. Suggestion 28. Tips for pricing residential permits properly. Mostly we've been talking about casual on-street parking pricing, but some of the suggestions today can apply also to residential parking permit pricing. So here are a few small suggestions. Most on-street residential parking permits are incredibly cheap, even in dense urban districts where the on-street parking is in very high demand. Ideally, the number of permits should not exceed the available spaces, and permit prices should rise until there is no waiting list. But it is difficult politically to take a privilege away once it's been given. So one way to phase in higher demand-based permit prices for a limited number of permits is grandfathering. This means people with existing permits will face the same old prices as before, ideally with indexing for inflation. The prices are grandfathered in, but any new permits should be priced at the new demand-based rates. This might seem like discrimination, but new residents should be told about the new permit prices, so they move in with eyes wide open. Gradually, as people move in and out of the area, most permits will eventually become market rate ones. Now, this process is being tried in the West End of Vancouver since 2017. I'd be curious to know how it's going. I want to end with two more suggestions on the issue of trust, that parking fees are not being wasted and that they are not going to the wrong people. Parking fees are going to be incredibly unpopular if people suspect that the money is being wasted and going to the wrong people. So suggestion 29, minimise leakage, which is a euphemism for corruption and stealing. Make sure the fee system is designed to minimise leakage and have lots of checks and balances to avoid corruption. Suggestion 30. Make sure the city gets a good deal from any private operators of the parking fees system. Most cities make use of private sector operators and vendors to set up and often to run the parking fees system. Citizens want assurances that these deals are value for money. So be sure to have competitive tenders, not negotiated appointments. There also seems to be a tradition, especially with negotiated appointments, of having a 30-70 revenue sharing arrangement, with only 30% of the revenue going to the city and 70% going to the operator. Now, this is a complicated issue, but get some good advice. I don't think that sounds like a good deal at all. A promising approach is to make sure the operator's share becomes part of the competition. It becomes an object in the bidding process. This came up in the Reinventing Parking edition last year on India's on-street parking, and ITDP in India has some suggestions on this. So, wow, that was 30 suggestions for making on-street parking fees less unpopular. Did I forget any? Thanks for listening. I hope this was useful to you. Please give me feedback. Go to the website, give a comment. Thanks a lot. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.